Today we're going to be talking about vCloud Automation Center and cloud automation in general, specifically with an eye around how to demonstrate and position this. Now, I've had a lot of people ask me in the past to jump on calls and help them demonstrate things like vCloud Automation Center, because it's kind of tricky and there's a lot of moving parts, and we have a tendency to just want to kind of somebody asks us the time, we just build them a clock when it comes to cloud automation. We just tell them everything. So I've tried to distill this down to what I feel is kind of the biggest bang for the buck that you can get inside of a demonstration and a customer outward communication for vCAC. So today, the things we're going to be looking at and talking about, we're going to be looking at whiteboarding vCloud Automation Center. And this is kind of not a real deep dive, okay? So I don't want you to get skittish. This is going to be kind of a, where does it go, how to align it, successfully, inside of the space, and what does it play with. How to qualify prospective customers' environments and their use cases, so you can kind of get a little feeling for things that you might mention, things to listen for, and then potentially maybe how to whiteboard those back out. I'll also be showing you what I like to call my down and dirty demo. So basically, if somebody calls and they say, hey, I have no idea what I want to talk about with cloud automation, I just want to see what it does. This is the demo that I do. And then a little conversation about endpoints. What are they, how to use them, and how to communicate them. We're going to look at what's new in version 6.1 and then kind of tie it all up with some licensing considerations and motions. So today, we're going to be standing at, I would say this is probably a pretty decent 201 level. We're going to be, way past the architecture type stuff, but we're not going to be getting into, any sorts of, practices or speeds and feeds. This is still going to be very easy to communicate back out to your customers. So let's start with this. Let's start with this idea of whiteboarding vCloud Automation Center. So a lot of you have seen me do this before. I like to start every single whiteboard pretty much the same way. You have, over here you've got your data center. And, out here somewhere, as nebulous, for lack of better jokes maybe, we've got what I like to call software, platform, and infrastructure as a service, also known as cloud computing. But everybody knows that I absolutely abhor the word cloud. So now we get out further and we have our user constituency. So inside all these spaces, we've got a ton of different conversations that can be had. We can talk about, everything from, on-prem to off-prem to, end-user compute. And, a lot of you guys have seen me, use this outline before, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it and even try it for yourself. So the question is, how do we align vCloud Automation Center inside of this space? Okay. Well, the first thing to understand, and I think it's pretty important when we're talking about, cloud automation, is to remember what the fundamentals are. And the fundamentals inside of the virtualization space is always server virtualization. So if we start here, and we'll just split that cloud right down the middle, and we'll say that we have a fundamental baseline of vSphere. And the reason I extended that out into the cloud is because things like vCloud Hybrid Service and DR to the cloud and all of those cool things that you guys have heard about, and if you haven't heard enough about them, there are more sessions around. Those things are built upon vSphere. So how do we position and align vCloud Automation Center inside of this? Well, vCloud Automation Center sits, if you will, atop all of these frameworks. So when we talk about vCloud Automation Center, we're really talking about a true automation engine in the purest sense of the word. It, in and of itself, is really not going to get a customer anywhere, right? It needs the supporting infrastructure beneath it to make it happen. And today, the things we're going to talk about are what is that, what are those infrastructure bits that it needs, how far can it go, etc. So now, how do we position it, and how do we map it to business needs? So we've got vCloud Automation Center out here. One of the fundamentals and one of the things that is often overlooked is how do you map it? So if I were talking to a customer, I'd say, okay, well, you've got your primary data center, you've got potential conversations about cloud. Obviously, you have some users. You've got users internally, and I would also assume that they've also got their external and their internal user silos that they've probably got going on. Marketing, C-level executives, all that sort of good fun stuff. And so we'll call it marketing and C-level. So what does vCAC do? Well, vCloud Automation Center is a single point of automation. Okay, and we're not going to say single pane of glass because, it's really not. It's multiple panes of glass that allows you to connect to a physical data center and virtual resources and automate against them, as well as automate against cloud resources. And this could include, as I mentioned before, things like vCloud Hybrid Service. It also allows customers to extend their cloud capacity for things like Azure or maybe EC2. And it does all of this using the Cloud Automation Framework. So what does this mean from a business need perspective? And we're going to look at a couple of ways to communicate specific business environments. But at a high level, if you communicate this to the customer right here, and you say, look, you can provision against physical and virtual as well as cloud resources, and you can provision and improve security for both external and internal siloed users, all inside of this very same engine, and give them access as needed and policy-based to these resources. That alone is an exceptionally compelling conversation for a customer who's even remotely thinking about cloud automation. So that means, Mr. Customer, that when you're talking about, let's say you've got development staff, internally who need access to resources, they're going to be able to leverage vCloud Automation Center to get what they need. If you have, let's say, corporate executives that are needing access to resources, they're going to be able to leverage vCloud Automation Center to get what they need as well. Additionally, if you have customer-based resources, external resources, they're going to be able also to leverage cloud automation to connect them to the right resources as well. The more focus when we're demonstrating and talking about cloud automation that we put on the fact that it is the brains behind all of the engines that lie beneath it, the more easy it is to communicate. So like I said, communicating cloud automation and qualifying the use case. Years ago, when I started in software development, my boss gave me a really interesting piece of advice. He said, you don't use a hammer to fix a windshield. And The idea was that, you have to apply the right tool, whether you talk about load testing or whatever we were doing back then. Cloud automation is much the same. When we're having these conversations, and we've talked before about this idea of developing and enhancing that trusted advisor status, where you're not just applying solution without necessitating a reason for it, and that's what really deepens and broadens those customer relationships. So if we look at how we apply vCloud Automation Center, we're talking about maybe they have outside resource requests. Right? Like we're talking about users accessing internal resources. Perfect situation to talk about cloud automation. Or perhaps you have those siloed resource requests. You've got resource requirements coming in from development, from marketing, from finance, from the executive level, all of these other multiple tiers. That alone right there on the right-hand side, if you were to ask everyone from the C-level executive down to the IT guy if they were experiencing this image over here on the right, I would be really, really shocked if they said no. I mean, everybody needs resources. So that means that in almost every environment, there really is a call to talk about cloud automation. But let's say we go outside of it into some of its more purest cases, where we can talk about those outside resource requests, but outside resource requests coming from multiple different points. That's where we get into that fundamental idea of multi-tenancy. And multi-tenancy is one of those things that vCloud Automation Center does better than anything else. In fact, it is native to vCloud Automation Center to utilize multi-tenancy. I know some of you on the phone have seen me, set it up, or we've gone through more detailed technical demonstrations with it. And, the very first screens, once it's, booted up, asks you to assign tenancy. You have to start developing tenants. And then once those tenants are in place, it can start, distributing out resources. So if any one of these three, whether you're talking about outside resource requests or siloed internal resource requests, or the fundamentals of multi-tenancy, lots of different people from lots of different places accessing from outside or in or both, then cloud automation needs to be on the table as well. Now, this is not to say that cloud automation is for everyone. Some of you, I'm sure, have customers that are still using, Essentials or Essentials Plus kits and things like that, and they've got, 3 servers. Is cloud automation going to make sense for them? Probably not. So how do we define what to look for when we're talking about cloud automation? Now, these are not hard and fast rules, just some guidelines that I and some of my colleagues like to use. The first thing to remember is that most people are really more ready than they think, because at the end of the day, all you really have to have in play is vSphere, right? That's the gotta have it. Now, beyond that, we talk about some recommendations, some things that we'd really like to see. Well, if you have, a fairly stout framework for what you're wanting to do with cloud automation, I really don't recommend trying to build it upon a 1 gigabyte, backbone inside of the infrastructure. It can be done if you're talking relatively small, and it will be very effective. But if your customer's really thinking about adopting this in a large way, especially, adopting and working out into, a hybrid cloud type of solution, then I recommend that you look for customers that are already on their way to or have already adopted 10 gigabit networking. Now, this is very cool for those of you who also do networking, because that means that there's kind of a hidden drag story here, right? When a customer comes to you and they say, we're thinking about cloud automation, not only inside of the virtualization space, is it just a compute drag? But now we also have the storage drag story as well for that level, for that side of your practice, as well as a networking story. Because if they're wanting to go big on automation, there's also some networking considerations. Now, I put down over here Enterprise Plus. One of the big reasons for Enterprise Plus is because of this right here. And you guys have heard me harp about this being, worth the price of admission for Enterprise Plus. And, I will continue to espouse that as much, as possible, as long as I can. Because when you're using distributed switching, you remove the possibility for human error inside of the virtual switch environment. And you also give a really solid backbone for things like vCloud Automation Center. So if you were to look, we can see that by leveraging Enterprise Plus and by, leveraging, that 10 gig backbone, then you've got these distributed switches living inside of these hosts, going back up to, a strong networking plane. That's going to give you kind of your biggest bang for the buck, when you're talking about moving between, private and public and internal clouds. This is where you really start to see bandwidth and effectiveness. So this is a little demo that I like to give. So upon logging into vCloud Automation Center, you see this administration panel. And to the tech guys, it's kind of cool, but to everybody else, they're wanting to see this, which is the service catalog. And, inside of the service catalog, I like to demonstrate for folks, you've got all these different services, and you can allow people to, click that gimme button to request new machinery. And once they do that and they request the machinery, they're going to be presented with a series of options. And those options are going to be tailored based upon this specific blueprint. And we can define things like, amount of memory, amount of CPU. I usually like to do a little demonstration in here and say, okay, well, let's pretend I'm really greedy and I request 4 gigs. Well, when I try to allot it, it won't let me. And so, here I've got some policy-based control. So now customers usually want to know, well, how did you do that? So I'll go over here to infrastructure and drop into the blueprints area, and I'll show them the blueprint for the Windows 7 box. So we'll go in here into Windows 7, and inside that build information, they can see where I set those tolerances. Can also explain to them how they can programmatically and based upon policy determine what the user can take action with against the machine. Can they do snapshots? Can they power machines on, power them off? What are they allowed to do? Now, once that's done, I usually take them back to the catalog and let them, soak all of that in. So they see here, how these changes are being made and how it can all be, nice and incremental. So changing everything from, CPU and, memory. So now they see how those services are created. The next question is, what are they created against? So we see here we've got Windows 7 is being created against a vCenter. So I go in here into Endpoints. We said we were going to talk about that. And inside of Endpoints, I show them the compute resources and these endpoints. We've got one for vCenter and one for vCloud. And really that's just a local vCenter and then a vCloud hybrid service instance. And then inside of vCenter, we can view the resources that are accessible for that machine. Now that they're, getting their resources and they know what they're coming from, I always like to show them before I'm done with the demo, IT Business Management. The exciting thing about ITBM is that when it's plugged in, it does all of this without any configuration. So all it needs is a little bit of time pointed at the infrastructure to build out these rate cards. And of course, all this is customizable, but it gets you started. And while it's pretty cool for customers to look at, server hardware and, operating system licensing costs and, all of these, fun and neat type things. And, hey, I didn't even know I had $187 in labor, inside of my house. But, it's pretty cool to know. All of that feeds back up into the overview. This is really what gets people excited. The idea of doing cloud comparisons based upon prevailing market rate cards for things like EC2 and Azure, as well as the private cloud, which would be their local data center. And they can also import their own virtual machines right from vCenter to determine where is going to be the most cost-effective way for them to run these machines based upon all of the prevailing rate cards and agreements that they have. And that's done in a really simple way. You just go into Import VMs, and you pick a machine. So here we're going to pick a web server. So we pick the web server, and then it tells us, based upon these three available spaces to deploy, where it's going to be the most cost-effective. So once you have completed that demonstration for Cloud Automation Center and vCAC and ITBM, the next logical steps for the customer inside of that call for me is to ask them, what would you like to see more of? Keep in mind, when I call this the down and dirty demo, that's because this is for the customer who says, I don't know what I want to see. I've just heard things about cloud automation. Show me what it does. So if I did nothing else, I would show them exactly what I just showed you, which is requesting a machine, how those parameters are set, sealing the deal on that understanding, getting them some idea of what an endpoint is to provision machinery against, and then showing them IT Business Manager. And then, that's kind of the, drop the mic, walk off stage part, right? Now it's up to them to determine what they want to see more of. So we kind of glossed over endpoints, but let's look at those a little more carefully. So these are examples of just a few endpoints. But the one that I cannot stress enough, and like I said, all you really have to have in play is vSphere. If you have vSphere in play, then you can talk about cloud automation. Even if the rest of this doesn't exist, they're not ready to talk about EC2 or hybrid cloud or vCloud hybrid service, or they're not multi-hypervisor. They don't have any more physical hosts left. None of that stuff is true, as long as they have vSphere. And like we said, recommendation is for 10 gigs and to be talking about Enterprise Plus. Then the conversation should go around to vCloud Automation Center. Now, most customers have at least this, right? I mean, that's why we're probably talking to them to begin with. A really great question. And if you don't ask this question, promise yourself that you will start asking this question. What percentage are you virtualized? And usually I'll ask customers to break that down into tiers and all that sort of thing. But even if you just say, what percentage are you virtualized? A lot of customers are going to say maybe 60, 70%, maybe low 80s at best, and that's if they count like all of their test machines, then that means that they have 20 to 30% non-virtualized. The exciting part when we're talking about cloud automation is for them to realize that not only can they provision against virtual infrastructure in cloud, but also their physical infrastructure. So let's say they are 80% virtualized down here. Then my conversation with them would be, that means you are 20% physical. And if you're 20% physical, how are you provisioning that machinery? It's a good question. I guarantee you one of the ways they're not doing it is through automation and policy. So this means that they can provision against not only their virtual and their cloud, but also their physical machinery. And they can use that with cloud automation. And we're going to be talking about a couple of use cases here in a minute. So remember, what percentage are you virtualized? And then back into the numbers. It creates a very interesting conversational turning point for them to think about all the things they can do with automation. So inside of version 6, and this is only important for you to understand the fundamentals of cloud automation. You have these two types of grouping. You have business groups, and business groups really are exactly what they sound like they are. In the physical world, in the virtual world, business groups are just that. They are, groups of users or, organizations, that you're providing resources to. Very, very simple. The fabric group is a group of compute, storage, and networking resources that are being accessed by these different business groups. So that means that each business group can get a different level or tier of access into these resources. So again, fabric groups are the resources. Business groups are the folks that consume the resources. So now that we know that, we talk about some use case scenarios. Now, let's look at our situation again. We have a data center, physical data center, like I say, in all of its glowing data center-y glory. We've got some cloud resources out here, and we've got some external users. We know that we're going to place cloud automation right there. So now we've got vCAC sitting right there, able to connect and talk to all of this. And we know that vCloud Automation Center can talk to a virtual infrastructure. To those of you that aren't hip to the new symbols, man, that is the universal symbol for virtual machine. It just so happens to be our symbol, but it is what it is, right? And we know it can also access physical machinery. So we've got some little physical servers over here. The vCAC can connect to all of that. And we also know that vCloud Automation Center can connect to the cloud. So let's say you've got a situation where maybe you've got different different cloud regions, right? You've got something up in the north, something in the south, and the east and the west. And vCAC can connect to all of that. Okay, so you got virtual, physical, and cloud in multiple regions. Okay, seems pretty straightforward. So let's talk about some customer utilization ideas. How would a customer use this? Okay, well, here's one. Let's say that you've got internally, like I said, you've got a development silo. And then after development, everything goes over to Q&A, right? So, and after Q&A, it goes out here to, prod, or, let's just call it, the C-level, for sign off and build out and deployment. And then out here, you don't just have customers in one little location, I'd wager. You probably, let's say those customers live in, Chicago. And let's say you've also got some customers, out here in, LA. And you've got some customers, as well, somewhere in Texas. Okay? Now, that's not all you have, Mr. Customer. You've also got, storage. Maybe your customers bought, really big, awesome, beefy, brand new, storage that's, all shiny and new. But they've also got, the little puny storage that they've had for a while, and, they don't really know what to do with that, and it's just kind of all laying around there. So now we've got a picture that a customer could understand. So now let's walk through a use case and see what this means from kind of a flow perspective. So, Mr. Customer, if you're developing software, the first thing you're going to need to do is provision resources for your developers. So internally, your developers would be able to access vCloud Automation Center. vCloud Automation Center, based upon the fact that it saw them as developers, would be able to provision against the appropriate resources. Let's say that's just, virtual resources, and against the old storage. All because it saw who they were. And it determined, well, you're not doing any load testing, you're not doing anything for production, so I'm going to be as efficient as I can with what I give you. So there's use case one. But now, let's say that very same workload needs to move over into quality testing. Okay, Mr. Customer, now we've moved over from development into QA. Now, it goes into quality assurance. QA requests the same resources, and this time it's going to request maybe one resource against the virtual infrastructure, a secondary resource maybe for a database over here inside of the physical infrastructure. And because we're doing some load testing, we want to test it against the highest speed storage that we have. How does it know to do this? It's using the exact same blueprint that we showed you earlier, but it's doing it based upon the policy and the person that is requesting the resources. You guys have heard me talk before about the ideas of policy-based automation. And, I think I mentioned to, some of you folks when I was down at the Clearwater offices, I mentioned, automation just means winding something up and letting it go. But until you apply some level of policy or control to it, it really doesn't make any sense. So this is the fundamental of policy-based automation. So now it's gone to QA. We've provisioning it some virtual, some physical, and some better storage for load testing and all that sort of stuff. Now it needs to move to production. So one of the important stops it needs to make when it goes to production, obviously you don't just want anything going to production. You want to know, is it approved or not? So you can build in an approval policy. So now when that same workload goes in here to production and let's say the executive level, let's say, we just deploy the application server here locally. We deploy the database over here, on the physical resources. We're, of course, going to want to provision against the fastest storage that we have because this is production. But maybe it's a web app. And we did say that we have users that access things in Chicago and LA and Texas. So maybe what we want to do is, because it's requested by somebody in the production group, that web application now gets deployed based upon who requested it. So we could have users from Los Angeles getting access to the web app in a Western hybrid data center. We could have users in Chicago, getting, something, up here inside of the north. And we could have users in Texas accessing in the south. And then even being able to do things like, spill over, as needed. The fundamental idea here is that with policy-based automation, you can take a single workload and you can use all of these different endpoints to their fullest potential. Whatever the customer's scenario is, you can start to fit it inside of these frameworks that we're talking about by having approval controls, accessing the correct resources, and then provisioning based upon geography and use case. And we keep our focus right here. This is the engine that makes that happen. So what's new in Cloud Automation 6.1? There's a lot of cool stuff. So number one, we've got tons and tons of new Orchestrator process automation plugins. We've got all of these workflows, and this is basically that idea of creating anything as a service, right? Maybe having human resources as a service, or creating entire clusters. Here you see an example of create a Hadoop cluster, or create a blueprint for an entire group of machines that deploy an inventory or shipping tracker or shop manager, whatever it is, and then being able to more clearly define what happens in those day two actions for existing services. And you see up here some of the things that I pointed out earlier, things like approval processes, being able to work those in more effectively inside of those orchestration workflows. That's what really gives you that idea of anything as a service. So X as a service, kind of stealing from the algebra there. So, remember, this is only limited by your imagination. It could be employee onboarding. It could be, mailbox setup. It could be, desktop deployment. Somebody gets hired, somebody gets, let go, whatever it is. Security and compliance, alignment, password management. Anything can be built up as a service, and with all of the new orchestration workflows we have, it makes it that much easier to do. Application server, which used to be called App Director, that's changed in version 6.1 now. Before, in 6.0, you can see over here to the left, you would have to have a separate app director, for each tenant, right? So you'd need one for this business group to control their application deployments, things like, app services and, the things I mentioned before, like anything as a service type of orchestration. And you need another one for tenant B. Now with 6.1, you just need one application server. It's no longer called App Director. So you have one application server, and that's able to deploy across all different tenants. So it makes the reality of multi-tenant administration much more streamlined. We've had the Solution Exchange and the Cloud Management Marketplace for a while, but there's a bunch of new ones, as you can see by the little new and improved sign over there on the far left side. Everything from building in new forms of orchestration for load balancing, things like F5, new storage enhancements, things like Viper or Hitachi, tons of new plugins and shell scripts for Active Directory. So you've got an active community of people that are developing these scripts that you could throw in to vCloud Automation Center, into Application Server, and allow it to automate all sorts of new tasks. So very exciting, and this just means that the ideas and the fundamentals of cloud automation are continuing to reach broader audiences. And the reason I bring this up in this call is so that you remember to if somebody says, hey, the thing that bothers me most, Bob, Joel, Frank, Ray, is that I'm hiring people all the time. Business is great, but I just can't keep up with it. Imaging new machines, I'm doing all this stuff, I've got somebody living inside of Active Directory all day long. Normally that wouldn't be something to think about cloud automation for. But now that you're seeing the ideas of orchestration and these points of integration, I want you to kind of wrap your hat around that a little bit and go, these are things I need to listen for. I need to listen for pain points that are beyond just, oh, I've got too many machines, or oh, I've got too many users, or whatever it is. Think broader and think more abstract. That's where you'll start to find these cool little corners for things like cloud automation to fit. We've also made some new enhancements. I showed you guys the ITBM standard, and you saw it live here a few minutes ago, and getting those auto-generated rate cards. But now we've got new things that we've done inside of ITBM. We have a more simplified showback. So you can auto-populate some of those cost profiles with your information a little more easily, and you can see over there it's got the little calculator view, so you can kind of drop everything in once you get the information back from the finances. And we've also added inside of the new version of ITBM vCloud Hybrid Service. Remember before when we looked at that screen, right? It had the private cloud, and then it had Amazon and Azure. Well, in this new version, we've added the vCloud Hybrid Service, so they can see what the cost would be based upon that rate card as well. And then a lot of people have asked for some more organizational reporting. So being able to break out cost and pricing by tenant. This means that if you have multiple tenants or multiple silos, accessing your resources, you can break out cost per tenant or per business group or per blueprint if you want. And you can get really, really granular for how this is displayed. And this also carries over into some of the showback reporting. So you can take this, and it kind of goes in complement to the cost displays that you saw in the last slide from the service catalog. And if you go up to the advanced editions, you can see obviously you're going to have the ability to connect with things like SAP and all of that, and get some additional cost and chargeback reporting. There's also been some pretty significant improvements around NSX and vCAC. So now we've really tightened down the integration between the networking provisioning and the compute and storage provisioning. So you could really spin up an entire data center with just that one gimme button, right? And an important thing to point out here is you're now talking about integrations of what are called logical routers, right, and logical firewalls. So what does this mean to you? So one of the things that you guys need to be ready to hear a lot of is this: micro segmentation. So that's a really fancy phrase, but what does micro segmentation really mean? Okay, well, here's the fundamentals. Here's the basics. Let's say that you have and here what we'll do is we will see if I can do this and be really cool. So what we're going to do is, let's say you have your data center right here, and then you've got the big bad world out there. Well, normally you would have a firewall between those 2 points. So this is considered, for good reason, north and south, okay? But let's zoom in to that data center. And inside of that data center, you've got, Department A, and you've got, Department B and Department C. How are you controlling traffic between these departments? Well, with distributed logical firewalls and distributed logical routers, that means that you can create common sense firewalls and rules between these points that give you east and west security. So now you're talking about security north and south, in and out of the data center, and east and west inside the data center. And really exciting is the fact that these firewalls and things follow the virtual machine. So if the virtual machine moves, then all of its firewall rules and all of its security policies move with it. So we know it's cool. We know how to position it. How do you sell it? So vCloud Automation Center is available both a la carte and also inside of bundles. So it's available in standard, advanced, and enterprise. Keep in mind that inside of advanced is where you're going to get things like the approval and reclamation and all of that. You also have the advanced and enterprise standalones, and those are also going to be equally important, especially when you're talking about really broadening out the access for provisioning to multiple endpoints, like things like Amazon and Azure and things like that. So what do the additions do? Like I said, standard is really just infrastructure automation. So this is where people are going to start. Advanced, you get that high governance. And what does high governance mean? It means they have the ability to do the approvals, and it means they have the ability to also reclaim unused resources. And then you get up into enterprise, and you have the anything as a service, which we talked about, which is like vCenter orchestration, right? Being able to integrate things like Active Directory and human resources and basically SOAP and REST and anything else that you want to integrate with it. And then also the build out of applications. So actually being able to configure databases and do stuff like that inside of machines on the fly while they're getting deployed. So this is really important. Like I said, if you look at the three additions, like I said, inside of high governance and advanced, you get that ability for approval and reclamation. It's important to remember that just because someone gets vCloud Automation Center, they're not going to necessarily have license across all of the different things that they can provision against. Right? They're still going to need to have the appropriate license for things like Amazon or EC2 or Azure or whatever it is. So if you look down here at this item number 2, heterogeneous endpoints, deployment into virtual cloud endpoints or use of third-party software mechanisms. So that's going to be advanced or enterprise standalone. So that means they could buy a suite and it could have standard or advanced. But then if they want to go out into Azure or EC2, they're going to need to purchase the appropriate number of standalone licenses for those deployments as well. Okay? And a really good architectural guideline for that when it comes down to it, and keep in mind this is pretty far away from the demo, right? But I felt it was important to bring this up to you guys, is to remember to always license for the maximums, don't license for the average. So as opposed to what you would do with like virtual desktop you'd license for concurrency, right? And you design for concurrency. When you're talking about cloud, you really want to try to license for the maximums, not the average, especially when you're talking about some of the third-party stuff because of the way their systems announce themselves. Okay, so with that, I'm going to encourage you to follow me at kgrote, and please also check out the new blog. You can see that at this location. It's at bigvirtualme.com, and you'll have all sorts of new updates and product enhancements, as well as Twitter feeds and ability to sign up for mailing lists and do all of that kind of stuff there as well.